God, thy sea is so great, and my boat is so small.
To be lost at sea meant wandering an empty ocean. A lonely ship far from shore and never finding safe harbor. These perils were the stuff of legend since ships first sailed beyond the sight of land. But until just over 200 years ago, there was no sure way of knowing the position of a ship on the high seas. Navigation became the greatest scientific challenge of the age of sail. Any nation which found a method of accurate navigation could rule the economy of the world. In Paris and at Greenwich, observatories were built to chart the sky in an effort to learn if the moon and stars could help guide a ship at sea. It was, of course, assumed that the answer would come from these royal institutions or great universities. But far away in a remote English village called Barrow-on-Humber, a carpenter named John Harrison was teaching himself clockmaking. He had no formal education, but his clocks were highly original. Harrison learned his craft while observing village life around him.
I, from being a bell ringer since a boy, had saw the bells swing in an enormous arc, 250 degrees or more. And when I went to plan out the pendulum of my first timekeeper, I knew that proper point in the swing where to best apply the force. I speak from strictly due experience, which is the best proof of usefulness, notwithstanding what university men may write or do.
Neither a university man nor an astronomer, having never been to sea, what role could John Harrison have in solving the greatest technical enigma of his time?
Slack away the tack, forward! Bristling on attack!
Consider the problems of the sailors and navigators of the 1700s. On the training vessel Eye of the Wind, the passengers and crew are about to experience the challenges of being at sea on board a tall ship and finding their way across vast reaches of open ocean. Will Andrews, curator of Harvard University's collection of historical scientific instruments, has joined the crew in this exploration of ancient navigation. They're trying out a replica of a typical log and line of the early 1700s.
All set, Tiger? Standing by. Ready?
It was a triangle of wood, which was called the log, and onto that was tied the line. It was a knotted line, knots tied at intervals of about 48 feet 3 inches. The navigator would throw the line over the side of the ship, and the first 50 feet of line would be clear. But as soon as the marker on the line passed through the navigator's fingers, the navigator would shout, "Turn!"
Turn!
and count the number of knots flowing through his fingers in the time it took a 28-second sandglass to flow through. This would give the speed of the ship in knots.
Measuring the speed with knots was one of the techniques of dead reckoning. It was a crude method, and it didn't allow for currents or crosswinds, which could easily push a ship off course. But it was then the only way to estimate distance traveled at sea. For centuries, mapmakers have used grid lines to indicate points on the surface of the Earth. This grid system evolved into lines of latitude and longitude. Latitude is represented by parallel horizontal lines circling the Earth, with the equator as the line of 0 degrees latitude. Longitude is depicted by the vertical lines, or meridians, running from pole to pole. Any point on Earth can be defined by a degree of latitude and a degree of longitude. But 300 years ago, only the latitude was measurable, and that with great difficulty. Navigators knew that the height of the noonday sun varies. On the equator, it would be high in the sky, but in the far north, the sun remains low on the horizon. By measuring the angle between the sun and the horizon, latitude could be calculated, if the navigator could survive the hazards lurking in his own instruments.
As a cross staff, this was actually designed for use on land, and it was adapted for use at sea. One of its problems is that one has the staff held against one's eye, and with the ship moving up and down, you not only get blinded by the sun, but you also get badly bruised on the eyebone. So it's not the easiest of instruments to use.
18 degrees above the horizon.
But without any means of figuring longitude, their east-west position, latitude was all navigators could hope to use.
The safest way to go was to get to the right latitude in waters that had favorable currents and winds, and then just go. Except that everybody else knew that you'd be going that way. So it was very easy for the warring nations to lie in wait for each other, or for the pirates to catch the cargo ships. And it was an untenable situation, but what else could you do? If you struck out on a new route, you were just as doomed.
On a damp October day in 1707, a fleet of British warships was returning home from battle with the French. They were just a day's sail from England. Although they had no way of determining their exact position, they believed they were safely clear of the treacherous Scilly Islands off the English coast. But as the ships sailed on, a crash was heard on the lower decks of the flagship. They had run aground, and the hull had been severed below the waterline. One by one, 4 ships hit the rocks, and one by one, they sank. In a matter of minutes, thousands of men drowned, and an important part of England's fleet was lost. The wreck of Admiral Shovel's fleet was a national tragedy. There were days of mourning, official inquiries. If England was to be master of the seas, how could such a disaster have happened in her home waters? An official of the Royal Navy, Samuel Pepys, had expressed the nation's alarm.
It is most plain from the confusion all these people are to be, that it is by God's almighty providence and the wideness of the sea that there are not a great many more misfortunes in navigation than there are.
The unfortunate situation had been exposed, and an outcry finally forced some action. In 1714, Parliament offered a reward to anyone who could solve the key problem of navigation: how to find longitude at sea. The prize was big enough to capture the attention of the nation. £20,000, equivalent to millions today. Proving voyages to the West Indies would be required to test the method, and a distinguished board would pass judgment.
Sir Isaac Newton, one of the prime commissioner, showing just how important the problem was and how high-powered the board was. The top scientists were on it, the top admirals, members of Parliament. This was a blue ribbon panel, if ever there was one.
But if Newton and the board expected that the huge prize would quickly produce an answer, They were frustrated by the rush of loony, half-baked pamphlets which flooded the bookstalls of London.
The only method for discovering longitude, humbly proposed for the consideration of the public.
Longitude explained, or taking the time on tiptoe.
William Hogarth's etching shows a pack of longitude lunatics searching for solutions within their asylum walls. Finding longitude in the public's mind had become the work of madmen.